Welcome to EWA's FIN-LYT podcast. EWA is a fee-only RIA based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We hope all listeners of this podcast will benefit as we deep dive into complex financial topics that we will make simplified for you. And we hope that this really serves as a catalyst so that you can make the best financial planning decisions for your family and also save time. Welcome, everybody, to today's podcast. We are talking in detail about stock. A lot of clients we have that are high performance have restricted stock. Some get stock options. This is very common among, Fortune 500 companies, if you're a key team member, executive, et cetera. And then also very common with startups as well. So, Jamison, give us just a high level, what is equity compensation? Why do people get it, et cetera?
So it's basically a form of bonus or compensation, but rather in the form of cash, you get company stock or equity in the company. Like you said, typically big public companies, they'll offer these to key employees. A lot of startups, think of a startup, they probably don't have a ton of cash to pay high wages. So in return, they'll say, hey, we'll give you equity in the upside of this company instead of a high cash salary. A lot of times this will basically the purpose is to tie the employee to the company. And so there, they may be, which we'll get into in a second, there may be some like vesting schedules. You have to be here for 4 years to get the stock, et cetera. But yeah, it become very common, tie the employee to the company for key people, and then basically give the employee a way to participate in the upside of growing the company.
Absolutely. So, you mentioned some of these companies that offer this are really for three reasons. One is retention, two is alignment of interest, and three you mentioned is liquidity. So the retention piece, we find this very common, with Fortune 500 companies. A lot of times they'll get these things called restricted stock units, which we'll go into detail later. But basically what these are, if you're a top employer, you're going to have your base salary, you're going to have maybe a cash bonus, but then maybe half of your compensation that year is granting in these RSUs, restricted stock units. So let's say you worked at Google, for example, and you got, $100,000 at the time of restricted stock units. Well, you're not going to get those hypothetically until they vest in maybe, let's say, 3 years. And typically they're graded, like some will vest every year, but let's just say it's every 3 years. So now if Amazon calls you and says, hey, you should come work for us, you're a software engineer or in sales or, some key role. If you leave anytime before that 3 years, before that stock is vested, you give up that 100,000. And during that 3 years, if it's a good stock, it's going to go up in price. So maybe the 100 becomes worth 150,000. And so if you get these every year, we have a lot of clients that if they leave the current job they're in, they're going to leave like $500,000 on the table. And so this is a really good way for aligning the company's interests and the team members' interests, because everyone benefits, shareholders, the company, the key team member, if the stock price goes up. So you're incentivized to work really hard, to make the company perform well. And then secondly, if you're a top talent, what better way to retain than, leaving $500,000 on the table if you leave. And then Fortune 500 companies don't necessarily have, liquidity issues, but because of the retention, the alignment of interest, we find this is very common. Most companies, in the Fortune 500 do these that are publicly traded. And then also, for a startup business that typically has raised outside funds and has a high scrutiny of how those funds are being used, if you're recruiting key team members, so if we think of a couple companies that we've worked very closely with, like Stitch Fix before they went public, we had a couple, key team members there. We had Carvana is another example. And so these companies in the early stages had these really key team members that got a lot of stock. And eventually the stock became worth a ton of money. And as the companies were growing, this is a way that those key team members that, some of those are our clients, they weren't going anywhere, even during the scary days, because there was just too much on the table for them to leave. Mm-hmm. So that's really why companies do it. But talk to us about, What are some other ramifications of stock before we get into the details of each option?
Yeah, I would say it's important. They're super complex. It's going to be a little bit of a different agreement for a private, like a startup or private company versus like a publicly traded company. So understand the differences. They're complex. Many employees aren't going to understand it. I'd actually got on a limb and say a lot of financial advisors don't even understand this well. There are advisors that specialize in this type of stuff. But the biggest thing is the tax. If you do this correctly, it doesn't matter what type of stock, which we'll talk about in a second, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars can be saved in taxes if this is done correctly. If it's done incorrectly, you could pay way more in taxes than you need to. But then, like you said, it can be used if you really understand this well as a team member of a big or small company, doesn't matter. It can be a negotiation tool for either the current company or if you ever leave. We've helped clients negotiate. They're getting offers from other companies, but they have this unvested stock, like you said, and that can be basically you can make the new company or ask the new company to buy out this unvested stock to make it a fair transaction so you don't give it all up.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's go through it. Let's go through a specific example here. I'm going to talk about restricted stock units, and then we'll have you talk about the non-qualified stock options, just because those are more complicated. And you put the outline together, so you'll be better equipped to talk about that one. So, okay, so restricted stock units. So Jamison's let's say a Google or Amazon, it doesn't matter. You work at a tech company, it's publicly traded. And let's say you have a base salary of 150 grand. And let's say you get a cash bonus of 50. And, or let's say you have yeah, that's perfect. So the reason I say that is your base salary and your bonus, assuming you get that 200, that's going to eat up the 10, the 12, the 22, the 24% tax bracket because you're single, filing taxes as a single person, right? Not married. So anything that happens with the stock, there's two taxes that can come into play here. There's an income tax and there's a capital gain tax. I'm going to break these down if they come into play, when they come into play, and then how to plan accordingly, and then mistakes we've seen from a planning perspective. So let's just say this company, say it's Google, decides Jamison is we'll just make up a company.
I don't know.
It's a new AI company that's publicly traded. Jamison's really into AI. So he's making 150 base. He's making 50,000 cash bonus, and they're like, we can't lose this guy. So he gets 1,000 shares of this company stock that's currently trading at $100 a share. So that's 100 grand at the time. And so the company says, Jamison, if you stay here 3 years, you have these 1,000 shares at $100 a share. It's worth 100 grand today. If you stay here, this all becomes yours. So first of all, let's say it has a 3-year vesting. So year one, he gets that. Does Jamison owe anything in taxes the year that he gets these RSUs? Absolutely not. They're meaningless right now. If Jamison leaves the company, he forfeits these. If Jamison gets terminated from the company, he forfeits these. So for Jamison to actually get these shares that are currently worth $100,000, he has to wait 3 years, and he still has to be employed at the company after 3 years. So if the stock price hasn't moved at all, and year 3 he's here and it vests, and Jamison's still making the 150 3 years from now, and then a $50,000 cash bonus, that $100,000 becomes ordinary income the year they vest. So that year, Jamison, you would show $300,000 as income before deductions. So right away, I want to say that would fall, into 32, part of that a 35% tax bracket, right? And so by default, some companies don't withhold any taxes, and then a lot of people get like crushed with taxes. Because if nothing gets withheld, you're going to automatically owe $35,000. Federal taxes, let alone state taxes, are a different thing. So
if you don't sell the stock too, you're paying taxes on this, but you don't have any liquid cash to pay the tax. It's still in the stock, which can be a big problem.
Yeah. So a lot of companies now, because this has surprised so many people, is they'll automatically withhold 24%. So if they automatically hold 24% of the 100 grand and you don't sell, so that means they would take that right out of the stock. So you would end up getting 76 grand, and then they would withhold 24 grand. Well, since your tax bracket, your situation, you'd owe close to 35. So that's an $11,000 tax surprise that you probably don't know is coming at the end of the year. And this happens all the time for those fortunate enough to have restricted stock units. So that's just something you need to be prepared. If you don't want to sell more of the stock, you need to save for that tax liability, in advance. But let's just go through another example. Let's say that the same example, Jamison was issued 1,000 shares, $100, 100 grand worth of stock. But let's say 3 years from now, the stock doubled. So if the stock doubles, you're going to have income of 200,000. So now, part of it, a little bit it's 32, a lot of it's at 35. So again, that's 70 grand of tax you're going to owe in year 2 or in year 3 when the stock vests. So now let's talk about this. This is very common. So a lot of people, just sit there and they don't do anything with the stock. They let the company withhold the 24%. They get mad about taxes every year because it's like, why do I owe 11 grand or why do I, 22 grand in that example if it doubled in value? And then what happens is they'll just keep the stock and they'll sit on it and they'll have this over concentrated balance sheet where like you're getting your income from this company, you're getting your benefits from this company,
401k.
your livelihood. Now suddenly 90% of your net worth is this stock. And so what happens then, what has happened, and so what happened in the case of, just to use a specific example, Carvana, I mean, we had a client that was, we had to, convince them to sell $300 a share. And we still thought, there was room for growth based upon, this client had a good relationship with the CEO. Well, thank God we did this because the stock eventually dropped to like $7 a share. Now, where's it at right now?
It's like 50.
So then it came back up. But
Still not even close
regardless,
to 350. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have, in this case, like let's just say you sit on the restricted stock for like 10 years and it's worth $1 million. And you're going to have personally paid $350,000 in taxes for that. So if you have $100 stock price that drops to 35, you've broken even on the stock price. If it drops down to 7, you've actually paid money you paid money more than you ever will get back in stock just in taxes alone. Because for most people, like a third of this is going to go right to taxes. So we recommend, on top of selling enough just to cover the taxes, you should be diversifying. Where most people would end up being 90% of the balance sheet, we recommend to flip that and make sure it's never more than 10%. So every year when it vests, there should be a discussion with, selling some of that and then diversifying it. And also, if you sell it the day it vests, you're already paying ordinary income taxes. You're not going to pay any further taxes because that is your basis. But if you, in that example of, $100 share price grew to $200, you pay taxes on the price at $200 ordinary income. If you continue to hold it that day moving forward, if you hold it a year later, and then let's say the stock goes from 200 to 300, because you paid taxes on the $200 a share at ordinary income rates, anything from that day at vest, if you wait a year later to sell it, the growth becomes capital gain rates. So you can always get the $200 back tax-free, but then the growth you would pay capital gain rates on. So just some considerations. That's just a high-level overview of how it works, why companies put in place is really to handcuff people, to stay in their current job, and then how you as an individual can, start to diversify off your balance sheet. And if you do want to switch a job, if you're going to a competitor, it's very common. We've helped many people negotiate a buyout where, if you're switching from, one drug company to another, let's say like a pharmaceutical company, say, sure, I'll switch. You got to match my salary. You also have to give me enough stock options up front. So like, let's say you were working at one company, you had $500,000 worth of shares in US dollars. You'd negotiate that with a competitor and say, listen, I'm not asking you to hand me $500,000 of shares like that vest, but hand me $500,000 of restricted stock that keeps me there for 3 years. At least I'm not taking any kind of haircut by making this big move. So very common to negotiate if you're a high performing executive or team member to get this to be made whole if you switch jobs. So you're not necessarily handcuffed. The right talent companies need and want, and they're willing to throw the dollars and the stock at you to get you. Yeah. So anything else to add to RSUs before we go to non-qualified stock, J-Mo?
Yeah, I'd just say RSUs they're the most straightforward and simplest. Think of it just like it's a cash bonus, but issued in stock. And then there's 2 taxes: tax when it vests, and then tax whenever you sell it.
And if you sell it when it vests, then there's just one tax. But if you sell it after it vests, then there's capital gain taxes, which would be short-term or long-term. So,
Correct.
Okay. Well, walk us through non-qualified stock options.
All right, so this is a lot more complicated. Non-qualified stock options they require you to purchase the stock. So RSUs are granted to you, just given to you as a bonus type. With the non-qualified stock options, there's going to be a grant date. So the grant date is when it's issued. So the best way to figure all this stuff out is find the agreement that when the stock was granted to you, there's going to be a contractual agreement that's going to outline all of this stuff. Get that document, and it's going to explain all of this to you. Mm-hmm. So the grant date's the day that's issued. You may get it granted year one, right when you join this company. There could be a 4-year vest. And what's very common is you'll hear the word cliff. There could be a 1-year cliff. So year 2, so your first anniversary, 25% of the stock may vest. And then 25% could vest per year over those first 4 years. So it's going to kind of come slowly over those 4 years. Could vest monthly, could vest quarterly, could vest annually. What's important about this is that doesn't mean anything with these stock options unless you exercise them. So you're basically getting the option to buy the stock at the time it was granted to you. The time it vests is when you get to purchase it. You get to purchase at the time it vests, and you're anticipating that the stock's going to go up. So when it vests, you have the option to purchase it on that date, and that's what exercising it is. So if you have, let's use an example here. You get stock at $10 a share, and then by the time it vests, it's now $20 a share. You can purchase it at the $20 a share, and the goal would be you hold it, it grows to $100 a share, and you were able to purchase it at this lower stock price. So that's the premise of it. And then there's a couple of different ways to exercise this, but before we get into that, typically you have 10 years once it's granted to exercise it. So this is important because if you don't do anything and you just think that these stock options are going to be yours, and the 10 years go by, you lose all your stock options.
Which is more common than, yeah.
Yeah.
So you got to take some action with these is the point.
So that's just the basic premise of it. Taxes, there's basically 2 taxes. Number one, when it's exercised, so whenever you decide to purchase it, you're going to pay ordinary income tax, like we said, same as RSUs. Second tax is after you sell it, exercise it, any appreciation is going to get capital gains treatment within.
If you hold it for a year or
so within a year, you get short term. Past the year is long term.
And short term would be the same as income rates. Long term would be capital gain rates.
Yes. A couple other things to note: if you get terminated, there's typically a 90-day window to exercise any options without losing them. So you have that 90 days. You got to exercise anything that's vested, or you lose it. Good rule of thumb: if you think the stock's going to go up, then
exercise them now.
Yeah. If you think the stock's going to go down, then don't exercise them because you could exercise at a lower price, pay less.
But still have to do that within the 10 years.
Yeah. And if you think it's going to appreciate, exercise it, hold it past a year because you'll get the long-term capital gains treatment, obviously. Anything to add on the taxes, and then we'll dive into the ways to exercise.
Yeah, no, I'm going to say so again, going back to a client we're thinking of, they became a client because they hired us to help them with this stuff. And basically this is, ideally, this person would have been a client well before, because basically what happened is she had, non-qualified stock options that were $10 strike price, but the stock had climbed to, over 300. And so what happened is, we wanted to diversify our balance sheet, so we exercised them. And then, thank God we did because of what happened in the future. But that $290 difference was taxable as earned income. And once we did that, we sold it, we diversified, and we were able to grab something that eventually otherwise would have become millions of dollars lost. But hypothetically, if we had done that, $10, it was worth $20, we had exercised them, then would have paid income rates on the difference of the 10 to 20, and then the 20 all the way up to 300 then would have gotten capital gain rates in that example. So instead of paying 37, we would have paid 23.8 in this example. So it's impossible to to do this exactly right, because we don't know what the stock price is going to do until, you're looking backwards. But just if you follow sound diversification principles, taxes need to be strongly considered, but taxes should never lead the decision-making process. They should be part of the decision-making process, but the decision-making process should be, hey, this is life-changing money for me. How do I make sure this is, diversified properly on my balance sheet, et cetera? And so what we see a lot of people do is they don't take any action because of how big of a tax it is. Well, a much, much bigger issue could be on the play where you're losing it all. Yeah. So thanks for breaking that down. Anything else to add before we go to a couple other type of stocks?
Yeah, I would say there's a few different ways that you can exercise this, which will be in the grant agreement. I'm not going to dive into all the details. Basically, you could pay cash for it. You do what's called a cashless exercise, where they give you like the difference in. You don't have to actually exchange any cash. You get the difference of what you would buy it for. Those are probably the two most common. So again, read the grant agreement and you can figure that out.
There's cashless exercise, stock swap, net exercise. I'm just reading all the ones you have. Promissory note.
Combo those.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So there are options if you don't have the cash up front. You can exercise them other ways. So work with an advisor to figure that out.
Yeah. And then so the only other thing, incentive stock option we're going to go into, these aren't that common, but it's same thing as a non-qualified stock option, just a little bit of a different tax treatment if it qualifies. It can get taxed at the alternate minimum tax rate versus like your income rate. And you want to dive into that at all? Or, these aren't that common, so
yeah, no, definitely. We've seen them several times, so I think it'd be helpful just to give a high level.
Basically, if you hold the stock for at least 2 years from the grant date and 1 year from the exercise, you can qualify for this treatment. Yeah.
Okay. Not common, but case by case basis. If you get these, then there's some tax considerations at play and some timing considerations at play as well.
You can pay long-term capital gains on everything versus the portion of it as income. So it could be 14% tax savings
if you do it right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to employee stock purchase plans. These are extremely common if you're an employee of like Microsoft, for example. So what happens is this is something that you can, you deduct money out of your paycheck that goes in your 401k, and then you can deduct money out of your paycheck to go right to purchase the stock. So typically the money goes in, it gets held in cash, and then every 6 months it will buy it. But the caveat is you get to purchase the stock at a discount, sometimes 5, sometimes 10, max discount of 15%. And that's the max IRS allowable discount is 15%. What's the max someone can do in a dollar amount per year into what's called an ESPP, an employee stock purchase plan?
$25,000 a year.
So if someone's making, $500K and you put 10% into your employee stock purchase program, you're going to get shut off halfway through the year.
Yeah.
So, a lot of companies we've seen, it gets held and then it purchases 2 times, sometimes it's 4 times. So even net of taxes, we typically recommend you should max this out, even if you don't plan on holding the stock, because there's some guaranteed returns. Walk us through the math there.
Let's just use $100 a share. What's important about these is you'll do like a payroll deferral every paycheck, but it's going into like a cash bucket essentially. And then, like we said, like 2 or 4 times a year, the stock's purchased. So a lot of times, if it's twice a year, there's 6 months, the money's going into like this account, and then it's going to buy the stock on those 2 dates. But let's just say $100 a share, you get a 15% discount, so that 2 times per year, the money you've put into it, you're buying at $85 a share. Let's just keep it simple. $85 a share you're purchasing at, it buys it, but then you could resell the stock for $100 a share. So you'll get that difference. You'll pay taxes on it. For
that example, the 15% return, even after taxes, is still probably 8 or 9% return. Yeah. So it's a guaranteed 8 or 9%.
Yeah.
And again, if you're able to max this out, you're probably making enough money that you're also probably getting some RSUs. You're probably already tied to the company. You probably have an overly concentrated position of your company on your balance sheet already. So the recommendation here would not be to get more stock on your balance sheet. It would be, hey, grab that guaranteed net after tax 8 to 9% return, and then use the proceeds to put in the rest of your financial plan. Like use that to max out backdoor Roths, or use that to to diversify in a regular brokerage account, like a direct index portfolio, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that brings us to some other things you need to know about stocks is 83B elections. So very common for us to educate our clients on these. Not often that the recommendation gets put into place to actually use it. Jamison, what is it, and why do we typically not recommend it?
You choose to pay the taxes at the time that it's granted versus when it vests. So we'll go back to that stock option example. You get granted it right when you join the company, and let's say the company is trading at $10 a share. You could volunteer to pay the taxes at $10 a share, and then when the downside to answer your question, why we don't recommend it, if the stock goes down, you're paying unnecessary taxes
that you'll never get back, and yeah, you just paid extra tax for nothing.
Or if you leave before the stock's vested, you just
paid
wrote
extra
the
tax
IRS
for nothing.
a check for no reason. Yeah.
Yep.
So definitely something to consider, but yeah, the risks are basically if you leave or the stock goes down, you're paying taxes. This has to be done within 30 days of when the stock is granted, which is important.
But the upside is essentially a 14% tax savings, because if that $10 grows to 20 and then beyond, that difference in what you would have exercised at a higher price, now you get capital gain treatments between 10 to 20 instead of ordinary income rates. So if you're in the top tax bracket, everything, between the exercise price and that original is ordinary income, versus if you paid it up front with the 83B election, then you've knocked out part of it already, and then you get capital gain. So it's good to do if you know you're going to be at the company for the vesting period. You're not going to get fired in that period. No one knows. You think strongly that the stock price is going to go up. If all three of those things align, then you can look backwards and say that was the right election. But that's a lot of risk to pay taxes up front, all in to save 14%, when your balance sheet's already overly valued, overly geared towards this company stock. Yeah. So case by case analysis.
And depends on your net worth, goals, etc. All that stuff's going to play into.
Okay, so let's talk about QSBS. Qualified small business stock. So very common in tech companies. So a couple criteria. This is for a startup company, we'll explain the rules here in a second. You must hold the stock for more than 5 years. There's a max $10 million max, and a 10x the basis on what you can avoid. Essentially, if you meet these rules, you're not going to pay taxes up to that level. Business must be a corporation, 50 million assets at the time the stock is issued. C Corp, 80% of the business assets are used for the qualified business. And some industries do not qualify. So it's very, if you've invested, the reason I'm bringing this up is a lot of private investments that people make, which is becoming more and more common. Because if you look at more than half of the IPOs in the last couple of years, they go public. There's fast money for the people that invested in these companies before they went public. And then they're almost like pump and dump schemes, and then they go down dramatically. So IPO market recently has been terrible.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, obviously, we recommend, good diversified ETFs, mature companies, et cetera. We don't have these risks. We don't recommend IPOs right now because it's basically a wealth transfer from the rich who were able to get these in opportunities before they were public. They go public, the rich sell out, and then the poor buy them thinking like
keep going
Instacart or something, and then they drop, and it's essentially a direct wealth transfer from the poor to the rich at that point. Yeah. So, but those investors that were fortunate enough to invest in a company privately before it goes public could get this QSBS treatment, and if so, it's a good deal because you avoid capital gains on your investment, which is huge. So definitely a question if you're considering an investment in a private company. The first thing I ask always is, are you going after QSBS? Are you going to run the business to qualify for QSBS?
Yeah, a lot of tech startups will, like you said, it's become more common. They'll structure the business to be able to do this already.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's pretty common now. But
okay, so when you're dealing with stock, we've got a couple of tips as it relates to financial planning. So, Jamison, what's our first tip?
We mentioned this, keep it under 10% of your overall balance sheet. Use the analogy of a pencil. If you had one pencil, try to snap it in half, breaks pretty easily. Same thing if you have all your money in one company. Actually, I love this. This is a fact that I heard that makes this relevant. Apple, largest company ever, biggest market share of all time. 95% of their manufacturing is done inside of the country of China. Political opinions aside, one single country that a company does that much business in, China could pass some sort of regulation that doesn't allow them to do business there. And yes, they're a really, really strong company, but they would suffer tremendously, potentially go out of business if that happened.
They'd have to redirect their workforce to the U.S. where labor costs would go way up, and then the stock price would go down at least temporarily.
Yeah.
So if you had an overconcentration in there, your net worth could be, not saying it could double in value, but it could be subject to a lot of risk on the downside.
So bottom line, if you have one company and that one pencil could break really easily, if you have 100 pencils with a rubber band around it, pretty hard to break that stack of pencils. That's basically diversification right there.
In each asset class category. So if you work, in a mid cap company or a small cap or a large cap, keep your entire. So we're talking if your net worth is $3 million, between your RSUs, vested or unvested, we don't care. Between your ESPP, your stock, everything should be less than $300,000. Now, some companies may have a requirement, very common if you're an executive, where you have to keep 1x of your comp, of your base salary. So if your base salary is $300K, you have to keep $300K of stock. But usually unvested stock will fulfill that requirement. So as soon as you have vested stock, we'd recommend, rip that off the table. And I do want to say, sometimes this will hurt people because the stock continues to go up, and sometimes this saves people. But a good financial plan, there's no...
You'll be okay regardless.
It's goal-based oriented financial plan. There's always potentially more money that could be made. Had I invested in Bitcoin before it became popular, had I invested in Amazon when it was, not Amazon, there's a million different things like that. So you have to think about it. What are my life goals? How do I want to protect my family? And make sure that decisions are being made for that. Because I can tell you the people that are really rich, it's an endless, how do I get rich? There's no meaning or purpose in that unless there is goals and purpose behind that. So much wisdom to be learned from people, perspective looking back on life. Well, the second planning tip we have is around taxes, education, understand it, work with an advisor, be proactive. A lot of times the decisions, going to an advisor too late, you could have wasted hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So understand the taxes, get educated, work with an advisor that understands them. Jameson, what's next?
We already said this, exercise early if you think the price will go up. Can save a lot on taxes. Next one can be a good use case for charitable contribution. You want to dive into that a little bit? Yeah.
So, with charity, you can up to 30% of your adjusted gross income. So again, if you're a $300,000 income earner and your adjusted gross income is, let's say your adjusted gross income is $300,000, you can put $100,000 of stock into a charity. And the reason this is so advantageous is that $100,000, which is above the standard deduction, you'll get an income tax break on that. Plus, if that $100,000 is made up of a stock that you got for $10 a share, that's not now going to $100 a share. Well, if you direct that straight to a charity or direct that straight to a donor advised fund, which then in the future can be used for charity, you've just avoided $90 per share of a capital gain tax. So when you direct stock to a charity directly, up to that 30% per year of your AGI, you avoid, potentially if someone in the top tax bracket or in the 300,000 single example would be 35, but you avoid 35,000, you save 35,000 in federal taxes in that case, plus you'd avoid 23.8% of the 90,000. So, there'd be essentially you'd be saving almost, over 50% of what you're donating in taxes between the federal tax rates and the capital gain rates on the gain, which is huge. So lots of case uses if you're charitably inclined. And you can put that into a fund where it gets invested and then you slowly then disperse it to charity over time, which is, we like donor advised funds.
Yeah. Okay. Last one. I think this is most important is think of the objective of the money of whatever this. So if you have 90% of your stock or 90% of your balance sheet in the stock, I think of this as like first principle thinking, is like, what's the end goal, and then let's work backwards. So this is how we get a lot of people with stock to really grasp this. Is if we talk about your main goal is you want to fund 100% of undergrad and postgrad for your kids. Say one kid, say we want $1 million set aside, right now your stock's vested. We could sell $1 million of it if it's worth more than that and secure that goal. It could be done. Or we could hold the stock. Let's hope it goes to 2 million. Still will secure that goal. Or the stock gets cut in half, and you're not paying for your kids' college. Pretty blunt and direct, but that's like what the trade-off is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thinking about what's the use, what are your goals, what's the use of the money, and then do you really want that goal to be backed up by the performance of this company? Probably not.
Yeah, one company, regardless whether you work there or not, I mean, it's putting the goals dependent on one company is more risky than gambling.
Yeah.
If you just look at how many years a company lasts in the S&P 500 right now, I mean, it's under 10, right? It's under a decade.
Yeah.
And so companies, the industry is changing so quickly. I mean, putting all of your, belief, conviction, and literally your family's life dependent on one company is not a smart move. And even if you're there and there's political concerns of, the leadership teams and executive committees, you still have to make tough decisions and secure those goals.
Every company is eventually not going to exist. I mean, think about it.
Well, it'll get merged, it'll get acquired, it'll evolve,
there's companies that have lasted for 250 years, but think on a long enough time horizon, probably not going to exist. Yeah.
Well, with that in mind, make smart decisions. Make sure the financial planning is leading the way when making the decisions. It shouldn't be taxes. It shouldn't be a gambling mindset, which unfortunately we see is very common. The discussions around this, well, I think the stock price is going to do X, Y, or Z. There's no discussion around until we force the discussion around college, around retirement, around financial independence, around those kind of things. So make the decisions with goals in mind, your family in mind, and then secondarily make the decisions as effectively as possible based upon the information we have on the table, such as tax rates, timing, navigating those concerns. So, Jamison, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week. Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. Hopefully you found this helpful. Really hope this is as beneficial and impactful to as many people across the nation as possible. So hit the follow button. Make sure to rate the podcast, and please share with any friends or family members that would also find this beneficial. Thank you very much.